So should we attempt to reintroduce red-billed choughs to the central south coast, by which I mean the area from Portland in the west to the Isle of Wight in the east, including the Isle of Portland and Purbeck in the middle. So back in, must have been the early 2000s, I was working as an RSPB conservation officer, and at that time 3 red-billed choughs suddenly appeared in Cornwall on the Lizard Peninsula, and one of my roles I was given when they suddenly appeared was nighttime kind of guarding of those 3 birds which were kind of hanging out in a sea cliff, roosting in a sea cliff at Lizard Point, and I would just sit in a Land Rover overnight looking out for lights, making sure egg collectors or anyone else didn't disturb the birds as they roosted in the sea cliffs there on the Lizard. And that kind of spontaneous reappearance of choughs has subsequently turned into a highly successful natural recolonisation of that part of Cornwall. So they've spread from the Lizard west around kind of Gwenepp and the kind of West Penwith area along the coastline, Cape Cornwall, and then now they're kind of spreading up the North Cornwall coast. Really successful, and they're nowhere near saturating the habitat, so I think there's a lot of potential for the population density to increase of red-billed chough in Cornwall and for their range to increase, especially along the North Cornwall coast. What they haven't started to do yet, although there may be signs that they are beginning to do that, is to spread along the south coast of Cornwall. That might well be that because kind of west of the Lizard the habitat is a bit more fragmented. You know, if you look kind of west from the Lizard, the habitat is more continuous, kind of. If you look east, it's slightly more fragmented. So it may well just be that they've taken the most obvious route and basically colonised westwards and then up the North Cornwall coast. They haven't yet shown much signs of a sustained kind of range expansion along the south coast of Cornwall towards Devon and Prawle Point, and especially not further east along the English south coast. That may well happen naturally, and so the question I'm really asking here is it worth us intervening to being impatient and attempting to reintroduce red-billed chough along the coast? So, beyond or after doing that, those kind of initial nighttime kind of guarding of those colonising choughs, I didn't really think about choughs at all in terms of a candidate for reintroduction until 1998, when I thought, well, hang on a minute, how is habitat distributed along the south coast of England, and given they're not at that point colonising the south coast of England, is it worth thinking about actually reintroducing them? So what you have is Kent, the White Cliffs of Dover, good habitat, well, reasonably good habitat. Then you've got the Seven Sisters and Beachy Head, nice, really good habitat. And then one of the white-tailed eagles flew over here. I'm in Ventnor on the Isle of Wight. One of the white-tailed eagles flew over here earlier, so I'm on the lookout just in case if the gulls go up and start to call, get a bit frantic, then it may be the eagle flying back over again, because one flew over about an hour ago. So always on the lookout for those. Successful reintroduction, it would seem. But anyway, so yeah, you've got the Seven Sisters and the Beachy Head area, good habitat. Then you've got quite a gap in terms of sea cliff type habitat until you get to the Isle of Wight, where you have Culver Cliff, the Undercliff where we are now, which has really good habitat, up between Bonchurch and Blackgang Chine, and then further west still you've got the Needles. You've got the Needles and kind of the Allen Bay sort of area, and then beyond that you've got Purbeck, which is superb limestone sea cliff type habitat with lots of feeding habitat, and you've got the Isle of Portland, which is a bit disturbed, but I think will eventually be occupied by quite a good chough population. They don't seem to mind active quarries if we go by Jersey's experience. So the question is, so there's already a reintroduction going ahead in Kent of captive reared birds, juveniles released at fledging time in July from big polytunnel type release, soft release aviary. So they're doing that in Kent, and I kind of joined in with the project planning workshops for the Kent project just because at that time in 2018, 2019 I was thinking about whether the Isle of Wight and Purbeck would be a good place for a reintroduction. So I joined in with those workshops. That Kent project has subsequently started, and a pair did actually raise one chick to fledging, nesting at Dover Castle. I think that was last year. So that has kind of some indication that it may be a successful project. And in 2018, I went to meet the birds of Poole Harbour. So I contacted Lush, Mark Constantine, to ask him if he'd be interested in potentially sponsoring a kind of a feasibility study for chough reintroduction in this central south coast area between Portland, Purbeck and the Isle of Wight. And he said, yes, go for it. He'll support a feasibility study. Unfortunately, it kind of became quite clear that quite a lot of work was still needed to be done in terms of looking at the feasibility and also meeting with farmers and getting some improvements to habitat in place before it would be really good for chough reintroduction. And I think Mark was quite keen on kind of shovel-ready type projects. But in 2020, I believe, the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust took pity on me, and they employed me in 2021 to conduct a feasibility study for reintroduction of choughs and soil buntings to the Isle of Wight. So I undertook those feasibility studies, and yesterday I recorded a video explaining why I don't think you should reintroduce soil buntings to the Isle of Wight, although up until 2023 I was very keen on pursuing a soil bunting reintroduction project. Soil buntings have recolonised as far as Purbeck, so you absolutely shouldn't do a soil bunting reintroduction. But I take a different view on choughs. So I undertook the feasibility study for the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust on the reintroduction of choughs on the Isle of Wight, and subsequently the birds of Poole Harbour and Mark and others and the National Trust in Purbeck have also taken forward that idea and have been working on their own feasibility study for Purbeck, which is really brilliant. So, and I think we're pretty close now to kind of confirming that the area, especially Purbeck, also the Isle of Wight and probably Portland in terms of them eventually getting onto Portland, this is a good area for a reintroduction. And I had in my mind's eye when I did the feasibility study kind of a conservation breeding program where you would have captive adult choughs. They would produce and rear chicks, and then you would take those chicks and fledge them in large polytunnel style soft release aviaries into suitable habitat, and they would then go on to occupy the habitat. You would have them fairly habituated, I think, early on, that first cohort at least, because there would be no other choughs in the landscape, and you want to be assured that they kind of, get to know the landscape and can find food right at the very beginning. And by habituation, I mean do what the people did over on Jersey for their successful chough reintroduction, the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, I think it is, which involves basically habituating them to the sound of a whistle. So you blow a whistle at feeding time, and then you put food down, and they work out that when you blow the whistle, that's when food is available. And basically, if you release them from your soft release aviaries and you blow a whistle, they'll come back down again, and you can give them appropriate food just to see them through the first couple of weeks, that first cohort, because there are no other choughs in the landscape from who they can learn where the food resources are, just to get them through those first week or two. And then you allow them to go wild, you stop feeding them. In my view, I think in Kent they're taking a slightly more hands-on approach. I would take a hands-off approach. And then in subsequent cohorts, obviously they would still be wild, or there would be wild choughs from the previous cohorts that have been released. So the new individuals you fledge each July thereafter for 6, 7, 8 years, they would have wild choughs in the landscape to learn from and to flock up with. So the methodology, I think, is pretty much proven. So Paradise Park in in West Cornwall, over many years, have perfected the kind of art of captive rearing of red-billed chough, and Wildwood Trust in Kent have taken that forward as well, and are now very expert at hand rearing, or not hand rearing. I mean, you can hand rear them as well, but having captive populations of choughs can rear their own chicks to supply reintroduction. So the question is, should we reintroduce them to the Isle of Wight or Purbeck? I would suggest probably yes. So unlike soil buntings, which are clearly recolonising, I think Choughs remains a really strong candidate for reintroduction. The habitat is here, so the one or two problems. So, I strongly suspect the original reason for Choughs being extirpated from the landscape wasn't so much habitat change, because there's still loads and loads of windswept open limestone and calcareous grassland on the Isle of Wight and in Purbeck. And that's always been windswept open calcareous grassland, even when livestock numbers have gone down and increased again. It's always remained suitable for Choughs. The cliff habitat's always been here. So I think the eggs were over collected for food back in the day. So we know that, for instance, around Knighton there was an active egg collecting kind of industry, really, where seabird eggs were being collected, cliff nesting birds and lapwings out on the arable. They were all being collected for food. I think just over harvesting of the eggs probably was one of the main drivers of the loss of Choughs. And as the population's driven right down, its viability comes into question. Although, the Cornwall recolonisation was fuelled by free birds, so one breeding pair and another hanger on, and it gradually built up from there. There may have been some other birds entering the population, but it was essentially started from a cohort of 3. So, but anyway, I suspect the main driver of the loss of red-billed chough along the south coast of England was over-collecting of the eggs. Or more recently, a new problem that's occurred after choughs vanished from the landscape is the overuse of anti-parasitic drugs in livestock and the subsequent kind of contamination of livestock dung and the loss of ground beetles and other invertebrates associated with dung, which chough do like to probe into. So that's one thing that does need to be addressed. And in Purbeck especially, the National Trust, I gather, they assure me the livestock that are grazing on their limestone grasslands that they own and their tenanted farmland, those livestock are free of abamectins and other kind of anti-parasitic drugs. So in theory, the dung should be relatively clean and the invertebrate populations associated with dung should be relatively strong. So on the island, as part of the feasibility study work, we did set up a farm cluster that did work for soil bunting and chough in anticipation of their return. This is no regrets kind of work. This is work that helps a whole suite of farmland birds, helps bats in terms of the bats that feed on invertebrates associated with dung. Lots of other species have benefited from the work the farmers have done in anticipation of the return of soil buntings and chough, and probably soil buntings will return to the Isle of Wight because they're just over the water in Purbeck now. Very small numbers. Choughs, though, I suspect it will take probably another decade or so for the habitat to be saturated in Cornwall to enough for more birds to start longer distance dispersal. Might be wrong about that, so they may colonise, say, Prawl points where there've been the odd one or two hanging around in the last couple of years around the kind of suitable Devon habitat. They may well colonise that part of South Devon quite soon, but I think it will take them a while to get to Portland and Purbeck and the Isle of Wight. I might be wrong, but I think in this case, a reintroduction can be justified. So I hope that the Birds of Poole Harbour and the National Trust and Lush, Mark Constantine can find the resources to kick off a reintroduction in Purbeck. That would be superb, and I hope the Kent project is successful, and I hope people around Seven Sisters and the Beachy Head area can also have their own reintroduction. Now what you would end up with is quite rapidly, a new population of red-billed choughs along the south coast that will greatly, in a habitat that's already suitable, that will greatly enhance the conservation status of choughs in the UK. What we know from Cornwall is that the kind of the southwest and the south coast, if you call the lizard the south coast, is really good. The choughs there are really productive and it's a rapidly increasing population. And I would suggest that Purbeck will be equally good. Isle of Wight will be equally good, not quite as much habitat on the island. And I think they'll colonise Portland, and I think they'll prove to be highly productive. which will be, you'll basically have a meta-population situation where there'll be a crossover of birds between Kent, Beachy Head, Isle of Wight, Purbeck, Portland, Trull Point, and areas in between, and I think they'll come to colonise novel habitats, or what we might consider to be novel habitats, but probably aren't for chough. Inland sea cliffs, inland abandoned barns, abandoned quarries. They love nest boxes, so we might be meddling a bit too much, but we might try putting nest boxes up in old pillboxes, of which there are plenty. They will nest in pillboxes, as we know from elsewhere, red-billed choughs.